Hello, this is Seraphim, and today I bring you a new original story on my channel about justice, hidden truths, and lives that change when karma finally arrives. The old woman's hands were shaking so badly that the pennies slid off the counter and rolled across the floor, and the billionaire standing behind her in line at a Detroit grocery store threw a $100 bill at her face and said, "Buy your dignity and move." The cashier, a 26-year-old woman named Grace Okafor, picked up that bill, handed it back to the man without a word, and paid for the old woman's groceries out of her own pocket. What Grace did not know, what nobody in that store knew, was that the trembling old woman in the threadbare coat was Edith Morrow, the secret owner of the entire grocery chain, a woman worth $400 million, and she had just found the person she had been searching for over 30 years. But let me start from the beginning, because this story did not begin in a grocery store. It began in a small apartment on the east side of Detroit, where the smell of burning toast and cheap coffee meant that another day had started for Grace Okafor. Grace woke up every morning at 5:15, not because she wanted to, not because she was one of those people who loved the sunrise. She woke up at 5:15 because the first bus to the Value Basket grocery store on Woodward Avenue left at 5:42, and if she missed it, she would have to wait 23 minutes for the next one. And 23 minutes meant she would clock in late, and clocking in late meant a write-up from Mr. Perkins, the store manager, and 3 write-ups meant termination. Grace could not afford termination. She could not afford much of anything, truth be told. Her apartment was a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building that should have been condemned years ago. The radiator clanked all night like a prisoner banging on the pipes. The kitchen faucet dripped a steady rhythm that she had learned to sleep through. The carpet near the bathroom door was permanently damp from a leak that the landlord promised to fix every month and never did. But the rent was $480, and in Detroit, that was about as cheap as you could find without sleeping in your car. Grace stood in front of the bathroom mirror and pulled her hair back into a tight bun. She had her mother's face. Wide-set brown eyes, high cheekbones, a mouth that turned down slightly at the corners even when she was happy. Her mother had been beautiful. Everyone said so. Grace did not think of herself as beautiful. She thought of herself as tired. She splashed water on her face, brushed her teeth, and put on the green polo shirt with the Value Basket logo on the chest. The shirt was a size too big because they had run out of smalls, and it hung on her shoulders like a flag on a windless day. She made toast. 1 slice because the bread was almost gone and payday was not until Friday. She spread a thin layer of peanut butter on it and ate it standing at the counter, looking out the window at the gray Detroit morning. The streetlights were still on. A stray cat picked through an overturned trash can on the sidewalk below. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. Grace chewed her toast and thought about nothing in particular. That was one of her skills, the ability to think about nothing, to go blank. To let the hours pass without feeling them too deeply. She grabbed her coat from the hook by the door. It was a navy blue parka she had bought at Goodwill for $12. The zipper stuck halfway up, so she always had to hold it closed with one hand when the wind blew. She checked her bag, bus pass, phone, wallet with $14 and some change, a granola bar for her lunch break. She locked the door behind her and walked down 3 flights of stairs that smelled like mildew and cooking grease. The building's front door had a broken lock, so anybody could walk in off the street. Grace had complained about it twice. Nothing changed. Nothing ever changed in buildings like this. The bus stop was 2 blocks away. She stood under the flickering streetlight and waited. There were 2 other people there, a man in a construction vest with his eyes half closed, and a woman in scrubs who was scrolling through her phone with the kind of dead expression that said she had just finished a 12-hour shift. Nobody spoke. Nobody ever spoke at the 5:42 bus stop. It was too early for words. The bus arrived 3 minutes late, which was actually early by Detroit standards, and Grace climbed on, swiped her pass, and took a seat near the back. She rode the bus for 27 minutes. She watched the city slide past the window. Boarded-up houses, empty lots, a church with a new coat of paint, a liquor store already open, a school with a banner that read, "Every child matters." Grace wondered if that was true. She had been a child once, and she was not sure she had mattered to anyone except her mother. And her mother was gone now. 3 years gone. Cancer. The kind that moves fast and takes everything. Grace's mother, Aduni Okafor, had come to America from Nigeria when she was 22 years old. She came with nothing but a suitcase and a name and a burning belief that America was a place where hard work was rewarded. She worked as a hotel maid for 16 years. She cleaned rooms, scrubbed toilets, made beds, and smiled at guests who never looked at her face. She raised Grace alone. No husband, no family, no help from anyone. She taught Grace 2 things above all else. The first was that kindness was not weakness. The second was that your character is what you do when nobody important is watching. Grace carried those 2 lessons like stones in her pocket. They were heavy sometimes, especially on days when customers at Value Basket treated her like she was invisible. Or worse, like she was furniture. She had been called slow, stupid, incompetent, and worse by people who could not be bothered to say please or thank you. She had been cursed at by a man who was angry about the price of ground beef. She had been told to smile more by a woman buying $300 worth of organic groceries, while Grace could barely afford ramen noodles. But Grace never lost her temper. She never snapped back, not because she did not want to. She wanted to every single day. But she heard her mother's voice in her head, calm and steady like a river that knows where it is going. Grace, you do not control what people do to you. You only control what you do back. The Value Basket store on Woodward Avenue was a large fluorescent-lit building that smelled like floor cleaner and overripe bananas. It opened at 6 in the morning and closed at midnight. Grace worked the early shift, 6 to 2, 5 days a week. She earned $11.65 an hour. After taxes, that came to about $1,300 a month. Her rent was $480. Her phone was $45. Electricity was about $60. The bus pass was $50. Food was whatever was left. Most months, whatever was left was not very much. Her manager, Mr. Perkins, was a thin man with a thin mustache and thin patience. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been ironed flat. He wore short-sleeved dress shirts tucked into belted khakis, and he walked the store aisles with a clipboard pressed to his chest like a shield. He was not cruel exactly. He was worse than cruel. He was indifferent. He treated his employees the way a man treats a vending machine. Put something in, expect something out, kick it when it does not work. He had never once asked Grace how she was doing. Not once in 2 years. Grace took her position at Register 4. She liked Register 4 because it was near the window, and on clear mornings, a slant of sunlight came through the glass and warmed the counter. It was a small thing, but small things mattered when the big things were all broken. She logged into the system, arranged her receipt paper, and placed her water bottle under the counter where Mr. Perkins could not see it. Drinking water at the register was technically against policy. Everything good was technically against policy. Her co-workers arrived in 1s and 2s. There was Dante, who worked the deli counter and always had a new conspiracy theory. There was Maria, who worked produce and had 3 kids and no days off. There was old Mr. Coleman, the security guard, who sat on a stool by the door and read the same newspaper every day, even though it was always a week old. And there was Keisha, who worked Register 2 and was Grace's closest friend at the store. Keisha was loud, sharp, and funny in the way that people are funny when they have been through enough pain to know that laughter is medicine. "Girl, you look like you slept in a dryer," Keisha said, dropping her bag behind Register 2 and pulling out a tube of lip gloss. She was always pulling out lip gloss. It was her armor. Grace smiled. Keisha's greetings were insults wrapped in love. "I slept fine," Grace said, which was a lie, but it was a small one. She had been up until 1 in the morning because the apartment above hers had been playing music loud enough to vibrate her ceiling fan. "You slept fine, and I'm the Queen of England," Keisha said, smacking her lips together and checking her reflection in the register screen. "You got them raccoon eyes again. You need vitamins, or a vacation, or a man with money." Grace shook her head. "I need coffee," she said, and Keisha laughed, and the sound of it made the morning feel a little less heavy. The first few hours passed the way they always did. A steady stream of customers buying milk, bread, eggs, cereal, diapers, ground beef, frozen dinners, chips, soda, and all the small necessities that hold a life together. Grace scanned each item with a practiced rhythm, bagged groceries with care, said good morning to every customer whether they said it back or not. Most did not. She did not keep count anymore. Keeping count only made it hurt. At around 9:30, Grace noticed something unusual. A black limousine pulled into the parking lot. Not the kind of thing you saw at a value basket in this neighborhood. The car was so polished that it reflected the gray sky like a dark mirror. It sat there for a long time. 5 minutes, then 10. Grace watched it from her register while scanning a woman's canned goods. Finally, the back door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, white, maybe 50 years old. He wore a charcoal suit that looked like it cost more than Grace's rent for a year. His shoes were black and so shiny she could almost see the ground in them. He had silver hair swept back from a high forehead, and he walked with the posture of a man who had never in his life been told no. Behind him, much slower, came another figure. An old woman. She was small and bent, wrapped in a brown coat that had seen better decades. Her shoes were scuffed flat. Her hair was hidden under a faded scarf. She carried a large purse that looked like it weighed more than she did. The man in the suit did not hold the door for her. He walked ahead as if she were not there. The old woman shuffled behind him, moving slowly, one hand gripping the shopping cart like it was a walker. Grace watched them enter the store. The man's cologne hit her register from 15 feet away. Expensive. Sharp. The kind of scent that said, "I am important and you are not." Grace did not know it yet, but she was looking at two people whose lives were about to collide with hers in ways that would change everything. The man was Richard Hale, CEO of Hale Capital Partners, a private equity firm that owned, among many other things, a 20% stake in Value Basket's parent company. He was worth, according to the business magazines, somewhere north of $800 million. The old woman was nobody, as far as Richard was concerned. Just another slow, poor obstacle between him and the organic coffee beans his wife had sent him to get because their usual delivery service had made a mistake. He had been forced to lower himself to shopping in person, and he resented every second of it. The morning continued. Grace scanned groceries. The sunlight moved across her counter and then disappeared behind a cloud. Keisha told a story about her cousin who had accidentally texted her boss instead of her boyfriend, and the whole thing had turned into a situation. Dante came out from the deli to complain about the meat slicer. Mr. Perkins walked by with his clipboard and said nothing, which was the best kind of interaction with Mr. Perkins. Grace drank her water secretly and waited for her break. It was 11:14 in the morning when it happened. Grace knew the exact time because she glanced at the clock on her register screen just before the old woman approached her line. The woman placed her items on the belt slowly, one at a time, with the careful deliberation of someone who had counted every item before picking it up. Grace could see the contents: a loaf of white bread, a small jar of peanut butter, a can of chicken soup, a bag of rice, a bunch of bananas that were slightly bruised, a carton of eggs, a half-gallon of milk. These were the groceries of a person on a fixed income. Grace knew those groceries well. They were not so different from her own. "Good morning," Grace said, and she meant it. She always meant it, but she especially meant it with the old women who came through her line, because they reminded her of her mother in the last years, when a Dooney would go to the store herself even though she was weak because she said the walk kept her alive. The old woman looked up. Her eyes were the color of wet earth after rain, dark brown, almost black, with a sharpness that did not match the rest of her frail body. She did not smile, but she gave a small nod. "Good morning, child," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear. Grace began scanning the items. Bread, beep. Peanut butter, beep. Soup, beep. She placed each item gently in the bag the way she always did, not tossing them the way some cashiers did. Rice, beep. Bananas, beep. Eggs. She placed the eggs on top, careful not to crush them. Milk, beep. The total came up on the screen, $14.37. The old woman opened her large purse and began pulling out a small cloth pouch. Inside the pouch were coins, pennies, nickels, dimes, a few quarters. She began placing them on the counter, one at a time, counting under her breath. Grace did not rush her. She watched the old woman's fingers, thin as twigs, sorting the coins. There was a dignity in it, a quiet pride. This woman was paying for her groceries, every cent, and she was going to do it properly. Grace understood. She began counting along, quietly, moving the coins into small piles. Pennies here, nickels there, dimes in a row. She was in no hurry. The line could wait. But the line did not want to wait. Behind the old woman stood Richard Hale, holding a single bag of organic coffee beans and a bottle of imported sparkling water. He had been standing there for approximately 90 seconds, which in his world was an eternity. He shifted his weight. He sighed. He checked his watch, a gold Patek Philippe that cost more than most people's houses. He sighed again, louder this time, making sure it was heard. Grace ignored him. The old woman continued counting. $7.42, the old woman whispered, sliding a pile of coins toward Grace. She reached back into the pouch. More pennies, a few more nickels. She was counting slowly now, her fingers trembling. The line behind Richard had grown. 3 people, then 4. Keisha's line was moving faster, but people had committed to Grace's line, and now they were stuck, shifting and shuffling and staring at the old woman the way people stare at a traffic light that will not change. "This is ridiculous," Richard Hale said, not quietly, not under his breath. He said it loud enough for everyone within 20 feet to hear. The old woman's hand stopped moving. She did not look up. Grace looked at Richard. He was staring at the back of the old woman's head with an expression of pure contempt, the way a man looks at something stuck to the bottom of his shoe. Grace said nothing. She returned her attention to the coins. $8.11, she said softly. "You are doing great. Take your time." Richard Hale took a step forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet store like a blade. He was not talking to Grace. He was talking to the old woman, but he was performing for the audience behind him. "Some of us have actual things to do today. Could you possibly move this along? Or perhaps shop somewhere more suited to your budget?" The old woman's shoulders tightened, just slightly, just enough for Grace to notice. The woman did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the coins, but her fingers had stopped moving. Grace felt something rise in her chest. Not anger, exactly. Something deeper. Something that lived in the place where her mother's voice still echoed. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Richard Hale reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his wallet, extracted a crisp $100 bill, and threw it onto the counter. It fluttered down and landed on top of the old woman's pile of pennies and nickels. "There," he said, his voice dripping with a kind of cruelty that disguises itself as generosity. "Buy your dignity and move." The store went quiet. Not the normal quiet of a Tuesday morning, a different quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone in a room simultaneously holds their breath. Keisha's lip gloss froze halfway to her mouth. Dante, who had been restocking paper towels in aisle 3, stopped and stared. Old Mr. Coleman lowered his newspaper. The 4 people in line behind Richard Hale looked at the floor, the ceiling, anywhere but at the old woman. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved. Grace looked at the $100 bill sitting on top of the pennies. She looked at the old woman, who had gone completely still, her hands flat on the counter, her head bowed. And then Grace looked at Richard Hale, who was standing with his arms crossed and his chin lifted, wearing the smug expression of a man who believes that money is the answer to every question and the solution to every problem. And in that moment, Grace Okafor made a decision that would alter the course of her life. She picked up the $100 bill. She folded it once, neatly, and then she reached across the counter and held it out to Richard Hale. "Sir," she said, and her voice was calm, even, and absolutely steady. "She does not need your money, and she does not need your opinion. Please take this back." Richard blinked, his arms uncrossed. He was not used to being refused. He was not used to cashiers at grocery stores speaking to him in complete sentences. He stared at the folded bill in Grace's outstretched hand, and his face went through several shades of disbelief before settling on a deep, blotchy red. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice low and dangerous, the voice of a man who fires people before breakfast and forgets their names by lunch. Grace did not flinch. "I said, please take your money back. I will take care of her groceries myself." She reached under the counter, pulled out her own wallet, and took out a $10 bill and a $5. $15. More than she could afford. Almost everything she had until Friday. She placed it on the counter, gathered the old woman's coins, and gently slid them back toward her. "You keep your money, ma'am," Grace said softly. "Groceries are on me today." The old woman looked up. Those dark eyes, sharp as flint, met Grace's. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the old woman nodded, slowly, once. She gathered her coins back into the cloth pouch, picked up her bag of groceries, and without a word, turned and walked toward the door. She did not look at Richard Hale. She did not look at anyone. She simply walked out, quiet as a shadow, and disappeared into the gray morning. Richard Hale stood there with his face still red and the $100 bill back in his hand. He looked at Grace with an expression that was half fury and half something else. Something that might have been embarrassment if he were the kind of man capable of feeling embarrassed. "You will regret this," he said quietly. "Do you know who I am?" Grace met his eyes. "No, sir," she said, "and it does not matter. Would you like me to ring up your coffee?" The people in line behind him were very still. One woman at the back of the line began to clap, softly, just 2 or 3 claps, but Keisha picked it up, and then Dante, and for a moment, the value basket on Woodward Avenue sounded like a place where something good had happened. Richard Hale slammed his coffee beans and sparkling water onto the belt, paid with a black credit card, snatched his bag, and walked out without another word. Grace watched him go. Her hands were shaking now. The adrenaline that had held her steady was draining away, leaving her hollow and trembling. She had just spent her food money for the rest of the week on a stranger's groceries. She would be eating peanut butter toast and ramen until Friday. Maybe just ramen. Maybe just toast. She took a deep breath and called the next customer forward. "Girl," Keisha whispered from register 2, her eyes wide. "You just told a man in a $5,000 suit to take his money and shove it. Do you know what you just did?" Grace shook her head. "I did what my mama would have done," she said, and her voice cracked just a little on the word mama, but she swallowed it down and kept working. The rest of the shift passed without incident. At 2 o'clock, Grace clocked out, changed out of her polo shirt in the break room, put on her coat with the broken zipper, and walked to the bus stop. The sky had gone from gray to a darker gray, and there was a smell of rain in the air. She sat on the bus and leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes. She thought about the old woman's face, those sharp, dark eyes, the way she had looked at Grace, like she was seeing something no one else could see. Grace wondered who she was, where she lived, if she had anyone to go home to. When Grace got home, she sat at her kitchen table and counted what was left in her wallet. $4.12. Payday was Friday. Today was Tuesday. 3 days. She opened her cupboard. Half a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter that was nearly empty, 2 packets of ramen noodles, a can of black beans. She closed the cupboard and sat down again. She was not going to cry. She was not. She pressed her palms flat on the table and breathed. Her mother's voice came to her, gentle and firm. "Grace, when you give something with an open hand, the universe notices. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it notices." She made herself a dinner of ramen noodles with a few spoonfuls of black beans stirred in. She ate it slowly, sitting on her couch with the television on, but the volume low. The local news was talking about a new development going up downtown, luxury condos starting at $600,000. Grace looked around her apartment, the stain on the ceiling, the carpet that was always damp, the radiator that clanked. She turned the television off and went to bed early, pulling the covers up to her chin and listening to the radiator's metallic song until she fell asleep. The next morning, Wednesday, Grace went through the same routine. 5:15 alarm, toast, peanut butter, bus, value basket, register 4. The sunlight came through the window again, warm and welcome. Keisha was there, already in full lip gloss. Dante was there, already complaining. Mr. Perkins was there, already ignoring everyone. Everything was normal. Everything was the same. Except that at 10:30 in the morning, Mr. Perkins walked up to Grace's register with an expression on his face that she had never seen before. It took her a moment to identify it. It was confusion. Mr. Perkins was confused. "Okafor," he said, "there is someone in my office who wants to see you." Grace felt her stomach drop. The last time someone was called to Mr. Perkins' office, it was Jamal from the stockroom, and Jamal did not come back. "Am I in trouble?" Grace asked. Mr. Perkins shrugged. He actually shrugged, which was the most human gesture Grace had ever seen him make. "I do not know," he said. "There is a lawyer. He says he represents someone who wants to speak with you. He asked for you by name." Grace looked at Keisha, who raised both eyebrows so high they nearly touched her hairline. "Go, girl," Keisha mouthed. "I got your register." Grace walked to the back of the store, past the storeroom, past the employee break room with its plastic chairs and dying plant, to the small office where Mr. Perkins held his kingdom of clipboards and schedules. The door was open. Inside, sitting in the chair across from Mr. Perkins' desk, was a man Grace had never seen before. He was black, maybe 60 years old, with a close-cropped gray beard and glasses with thin gold frames. He wore a dark blue suit, not flashy but expensive in the quiet way that real money announces itself. A leather briefcase sat at his feet. He stood when Grace entered, and he extended his hand. "Ms. Okafor," he said, and his voice was warm and deep, like the lower register of a church organ. "My name is Thomas Whitfield. I am an attorney. I represent a client who would like to meet with you at your earliest convenience." Grace shook his hand. It was firm and dry. "A client," Grace repeated. "Who?" Thomas Whitfield smiled, and it was the kind of smile that holds a secret. "My client prefers to introduce herself in person. I have been asked to deliver this." He reached into his briefcase and produced an envelope. It was cream-colored, heavy, the kind of paper that feels like cloth. On the front, in neat handwriting, it said simply, "For Grace." Grace took the envelope. It weighed almost nothing, but it felt heavier than anything she had ever held. She looked at Mr. Whitfield, then at Mr. Perkins, who was standing in the corner of his own office like a guest at someone else's party. "Can I open this now?" she asked. "That is entirely your decision," Mr. Whitfield said. Grace slid her finger under the flap and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. She unfolded it. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope, neat and deliberate. It read, "Dear Grace, yesterday you paid for a stranger's groceries with money you could not afford. You did not do it for a reward. You did it because it was right. I have not seen that kind of kindness in a very long time. I would like to meet you if you are willing. My driver will pick you up at the address on the back of this letter tomorrow morning at 9. You are not in any trouble. Quite the opposite. Sincerely, Edith." Grace turned the paper over. On the back was an address on Boston Boulevard, in one of the old mansion districts of Detroit. She read the letter again, then a third time. She looked at Mr. Whitfield. "The woman from yesterday," Grace said slowly. "The old woman with the coins." Mr. Whitfield nodded. "My client is not accustomed to explaining herself," he said, "but she would like to explain herself to you." He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and picked up his briefcase. "I will tell her to expect you. 9 o'clock, tomorrow." He handed Grace a business card. "If you have any concerns, call me at any time." He nodded to Mr. Perkins, who nodded back with the expression of a man whose world had just tilted slightly to the left, and then Thomas Whitfield walked out of the store, got into a black sedan that was parked next to the limousine spot from yesterday, and drove away. Grace stood in Mr. Perkins' office, holding the letter. Her hands were not shaking this time. They were steady. But something inside her was shaking, deep down, in the place where feelings live before they become words. She folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and placed it carefully inside her coat pocket. "Can I go back to my register?" she asked. Mr. Perkins nodded, still looking confused. Grace walked back to Register 4, and when Keisha asked what happened, Grace said, "I do not know yet." And that was the truth. That night, Grace sat at her kitchen table and read the letter 7 more times. She held it up to the light. She smelled it. It smelled faintly of lavender. She traced the handwriting with her finger. She thought about the old woman's eyes, those dark, sharp eyes that had studied her with such intensity. Who was Edith? Why did she send a lawyer? What was on Boston Boulevard? Grace picked up her phone and typed the address into a search engine. The results showed a mansion. Not a house, a mansion. A stone-faced, three-story mansion with columns and iron gates, built in the 1920s, listed as a historic property. Grace stared at the picture. Then she closed her phone and stared at the ceiling. She could not sleep. She lay in bed and listened to the radiator and the dripping faucet and the muffled bass of music from somewhere in the building. Her mind raced. She thought about what she would wear. She did not own anything nice. She had 2 pairs of jeans, some t-shirts, her work polos, and one dress that she had bought for her mother's funeral, a simple black dress that hung in the back of her closet like a shadow. She would wear the dress. It was the only thing she had that looked like it belonged in a mansion on Boston Boulevard. Thursday morning. Grace did not go to work. She had called Mr. Perkins the night before and asked for the day off. He had said yes without asking why, which was unprecedented. Maybe the lawyer's visit had softened something in him, or maybe he just did not care. Grace showered, put on the black dress, looked at herself in the mirror. The dress still fit. It was still simple and clean. She put on her good shoes, the black flats she had bought at a clearance sale 2 years ago. She brushed her hair and left it down for once, instead of pulling it back. She looked different with her hair down, softer, more like her mother. At exactly 9 o'clock, a black car pulled up in front of her building. Not a limousine, a town car, black and understated. The driver got out. He was an older man, white-haired, in a dark suit and driving cap. He opened the back door for Grace without a word. She got in. The seats were leather. The car smelled like wood polish and mint. They drove in silence through the streets of Detroit, from the east side to the boulevard, past the boarded-up houses and the empty lots, and then, gradually, into a neighborhood that felt like a different planet. Trees lined the streets. The houses grew larger. The sidewalks were clean. The lawns were green even though it was late autumn. The car pulled up to a gate. Iron. Tall. The driver pressed a button and the gate swung open. They drove up a circular driveway to the front of the mansion Grace had seen on her phone screen. But pictures did not do it justice. The building was massive. Stone walls covered in ivy, windows that glinted like eyes. A front door made of dark wood with a brass knocker shaped like a lion's head. Grace sat in the car for a moment, looking at it. Her hands gripped the strap of her purse. She thought about her apartment, the damp carpet, the broken zipper, and now this. She took a breath and got out of the car. Thomas Whitfield was waiting at the front door. He was wearing the same kind of quiet suit, and his smile was the same, warm and secret-keeping. "Ms. Okafor," he said, "thank you for coming. Please follow me." He led her through the front door and into a foyer that was larger than her entire apartment. The floor was marble. A staircase curved upward to the left. On the walls were paintings, real paintings, not prints, in gilded frames. Grace could hear a clock ticking somewhere, deep and steady, like a heartbeat. The house smelled like old wood and furniture polish, and, underneath it all, lavender. The same lavender from the letter. They walked through a hallway lined with bookcases, past a room with a grand piano, past a dining room with a table long enough to seat 20 people, and into a smaller room at the back of the house. This room was different. It was warm. It had a fireplace with a real fire burning. 2 armchairs faced each other in front of the fire. In one of the armchairs sat the old woman from the grocery store. She looked different today. Not because she was dressed differently. She was still wearing simple clothes, a cream-colored blouse and dark pants. No jewelry, no display of wealth. But there was something about her in this room, in this house, that changed the way Grace saw her. She was not frail here. She was settled. She belonged. "Sit down, child," Edith Morrow said. Her voice was the same, quiet but clear. Grace sat in the other armchair. The fire crackled. Thomas Whitfield stood near the door, hands clasped behind his back, watching. Grace waited. She had learned from her mother that when someone old invites you to sit, you sit, and you wait for them to speak. Edith studied Grace for a long time. Her dark eyes moved over Grace's face the way a painter studies a canvas. Then she spoke. "You paid for my groceries," she said. It was not a question. Grace nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Edith's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Do you know what most people would have done in your situation?" Grace thought about it. "Probably nothing," she said. Edith shook her head slowly. "Worse than nothing. Most people would have taken that man's money, put it in the register, bagged my groceries, moved me along. Efficient, practical. And they would have been right in a way. $100 is $100. But you did not do that." Grace felt her throat tighten. "No, ma'am." Edith leaned forward slightly. "Why not?" Grace thought about this. She could have given a quick answer. She could have said something about kindness or respect or doing the right thing, but Edith's eyes demanded something real. So Grace told the truth. "Because my mother raised me alone," she said, her voice steady but soft. "She cleaned hotel rooms for 16 years. She came home every night with her back hurting and her hands cracked, and she never once complained. And sometimes people talked to her the way that man talked to you, like she was less, like she did not matter. And it used to make me so angry I could not see straight. But she would always tell me the same thing. She said, 'Grace, when the world shows you ugly, you show it beautiful. That is how you win.'" The fire crackled. A log shifted. Grace swallowed hard. "So when that man threw his money at you, I was not thinking about him. I was thinking about my mama. I was thinking, what would she want me to do? And I knew. I knew exactly what she would want." Edith was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Your mother, what was her name?" Grace blinked. "Aduni," she said. "Aduni Okafor." And something happened to Edith's face when Grace said her mother's name. Something moved behind those sharp, dark eyes. Something deep and old and painful. Edith closed her eyes and was silent for so long that Grace wondered if she had fallen asleep. Then Edith opened her eyes, and they were wet. Not crying, but wet, close to the edge. "Tell me about her," Edith whispered. "Tell me everything." So Grace did. She talked for almost an hour. She told Edith about Aduni's laugh, which was big and round and filled whatever room she was in. She told her about the way Aduni sang Nigerian hymns while she cooked jollof rice on Sunday afternoons. She told her about the way Aduni would braid Grace's hair every night before bed, her fingers quick and gentle, humming under her breath. She told her about the cancer, how fast it came, how it stole everything in 6 months, how at the end, Aduni could barely whisper, but the last thing she said was, "Be kind, Grace. Always be kind." When Grace finished, the room was very quiet. The fire had burned down to embers. Thomas Whitfield had taken a seat near the door and was looking at his hands. Edith Morrow sat in her armchair, completely still, tears running down the deep lines of her face. She did not wipe them, she let them fall. Then she reached out and took Grace's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Child," Edith said, "I need to tell you who I am, and I need to tell you why I was in that store." Grace felt her pulse quicken. She gripped Edith's hand back. The old woman's skin was cool and papery, but underneath there was iron. "My full name is Edith Adebayo Morrow," she said. "I was born in Lagos, Nigeria, in 1943. I came to this country in 1965 with nothing, less than nothing. I worked as a cleaning woman for 7 years. Then I saved enough money to open a small grocery store on the east side of Detroit. I sold rice, beans, palm oil, and whatever people in our community needed. I called the store Value Basket." Grace felt the ground shift beneath her. The room tilted. Value Basket. She was sitting in the home of the woman who had created Value Basket. But that was impossible. Value Basket was a chain. There were 47 stores across Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. It was a corporation. It had a board of directors. It had a logo and a slogan and a website and a stock price. Grace opened her mouth, but no words came out. Edith continued, her voice steady and measured, as if she were reading from a history book. "I built that store from nothing. One store became 2. 2 became 5. 5 became 20. I built Value Basket into what it is today. I own 51% of the company through a holding trust. Nobody knows this. Not the employees. Not the managers. Not even most of the board. My name does not appear on any public document. Thomas here handles everything through legal entities. As far as the world is concerned, I am nobody. An old woman buying groceries with coins. Grace stared at her. Her mind was trying to rearrange itself around this new information, like furniture being shoved to the edges of a room to make space for something enormous. "But the coins," Grace whispered. "The pennies and nickels. Why?" Edith's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. "Because I have been doing this for 30 years, she said. "Every few months I go to one of my stores. I dress like this. I carry my coins. I buy a few groceries. And I pay slowly. Very slowly. I watch. I watch who helps me and who ignores me, who is patient and who is cruel, who sees me as a person and who sees me as a problem." Grace felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Edith's eyes locked onto hers. "In 30 years, do you know how many cashiers have done what you did? How many people stood up for me against a man with money and power?" Grace shook her head. "None," Edith said. "Not one. In 30 years. Some were polite, some were patient. But when the pressure came, when someone with authority and money pushed, everyone stepped aside. Everyone. Until you." The weight of those words settled on Grace like a blanket. She did not know what to say. She sat there, holding the old woman's hand, listening to the fire die and the clock tick, and she thought about her mother. Aduni, who had also come from Nigeria with nothing. Aduni, who had also worked as a cleaning woman. Aduni, who had also built a life from the ground up. Only her building had been a daughter, not a company. And suddenly Grace understood something. She understood why Edith's eyes had changed when she heard Aduni's name. It was not just sympathy, it was recognition. One woman seeing her own story reflected in another's. "There is something else," Edith said, and her voice changed now, became quieter, more fragile, as if the next words would cost her something. "I had a daughter. Her name was Amara. She was the reason I built everything. Every store, every dollar, every late night, every sacrifice. It was all for her, and she died. 28 years ago, car accident. She was 23 years old. She had just finished college. She was going to be a doctor." Edith paused. The tears were flowing again, but her voice did not break. "After she died, I kept building, because that is what I know how to do. I built and built and built. But there was a hole in the center of it all. A hole shaped like my daughter." Grace's own eyes were burning now. She thought of her mother's last days, the hospital room, the sound of the machines, the silence that came after. She knew about holes shaped like the people you have lost. She knew about the way they never fill. "When I saw you in that store," Edith continued, "something happened. You looked at me the way Amara used to look at me, with that same fierce gentleness, and when you stood up to that man, when you reached into your own pocket with nothing to give, you did what Amara would have done. Exactly what she would have done. You reminded me of my daughter, child. Not your face, not your voice, your spirit, the thing inside you that will not bow." Thomas Whitfield cleared his throat from a seat by the door. He opened his briefcase and produced a folder. He stood, walked to Grace, and handed it to her. "Ms. Morrow has asked me to prepare some documents for your review," he said, his voice professional but kind. "There is no pressure. You can take all the time you need." Grace opened the folder. Inside were several papers. She began reading, and as she read, her hands started to tremble so badly that the pages rustled like leaves in a storm. She read the first page, then the second, then the third. She looked up at Edith. She looked at Thomas. She looked back at the papers. "I do not understand," Grace whispered. But she did. She understood every word. She just could not believe them. The document said that Edith Morrow was establishing a trust in Grace's name. The trust would provide a full scholarship to any university Grace wished to attend. It would provide a living stipend of $3,000 a month for the duration of her education. It would provide health insurance, and upon Edith's death, a portion of Edith's personal estate, an amount that the documents listed as $5 million, would be transferred to Grace. $5 million. Grace put the papers down on her lap. The room was spinning, but not the kind of spinning that comes from dizziness. It was the spinning that comes when reality rearranges itself into a shape you have never seen before. "Mrs. Morrow," Grace said, and her voice was barely a whisper, "I cannot accept this. I only paid for your groceries. That was $15. Edith laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and surprised, and it sounded like it had not been used in a long time. "Child," she said, "I am not paying you for groceries. I have more money than I will ever spend. What I do not have is my daughter. What I do not have is someone who reminds me of what matters. You are not being paid. You are being chosen." Grace did not sign anything that day. She asked for time, and Edith gave it to her without argument. Thomas drove her home in the town car. Grace sat in the back seat and did not speak. When she got to her apartment, she sat on the couch and stared at the wall for 2 hours. The folder was on the kitchen table. She did not open it again, not yet. She needed to think. She needed to understand what was happening. She needed to talk to someone. She called Keisha. It was the only person she could think of. Keisha answered on the second ring. "Girl, where were you today? Perkins was like a lost puppy without you to ignore." Grace tried to figure out where to start. She opened her mouth and what came out was, "Keisha, the old woman from the store is a billionaire and she wants to put me in her will." The silence on the other end lasted approximately 4 seconds, which for Keisha was an eternity. "I know you did not just say what I think you said," Keisha breathed. "Say that again, slowly." Grace told her everything. The letter, the lawyer, the mansion, the fire, the coins, value basket, the daughter, the trust, the $5 million. Keisha was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Grace, do you understand what is happening to you right now? This is one of those stories. This is one of those stories where the poor girl turns out to be chosen, and the rich man who threw money at the old lady is about to get what is coming to him, and everything changes. This is that story, Grace, and you are living it. Grace pressed the phone to her ear and closed her eyes. "I am scared," she admitted. "Scared of what?" Keisha asked. "Scared that it is real," Grace said, "and scared that it is not." But it was real, very real, and what Grace did not know yet, what she could not have predicted, was that the story was not even close to being finished. Because Richard Hale had not forgotten what happened in that grocery store. A man like Richard Hale does not get humiliated by a cashier and walk away. He had called the Value Basket corporate office that same Tuesday afternoon. He had demanded that Grace Okafor be terminated immediately. He had used his position as a shareholder. He had used his name. He had used his money. And someone at the corporate office had listened. On Friday morning, when Grace arrived at work, Mr. Perkins was waiting for her by the time clock. His face had that iron-flat expression again, but there was something else underneath it, something that looked, if you squinted, like regret. "Okafor," he said. "My office, now." Grace followed him. She had a bad feeling. The kind of feeling that starts in your knees and works its way up. Mr. Perkins sat behind his desk and picked up a piece of paper. He did not look at Grace when he spoke. "I received a call from corporate yesterday," he said. "There has been a complaint filed against you. A customer. He says you were disrespectful and refused to provide adequate service. Corporate has instructed me to terminate your employment, effective immediately." Grace stood very still. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She gripped the back of the chair in front of her. "Mr. Perkins," she said, and her voice was steady even though her insides were dissolving. "You were here. You saw what happened. That man threw money at an elderly woman's face. I stood up for her. That is not disrespect. That is basic human decency." Mr. Perkins closed his eyes. He pinched the bridge of his nose. "I know what happened," he said quietly, "but the call came from the top. This man has connections. He is a shareholder. My hands are tied, Okafor. I am sorry." He slid a termination form across the desk. Sign this and collect your last paycheck from the office. Grace looked at the form. Her name was already printed on it. Reason for termination. Customer service violation. She felt something cold settle in her chest. Not sadness, not anger. Something else. Something harder. She thought about her mother. 16 years of cleaning hotel rooms. Never complaining. Never being seen. And then dying anyway, with nothing to show for it but a daughter who was about to be homeless. Grace picked up the pen. Her hand did not shake. She signed the form. She placed the pen on the desk. She looked at Mr. Perkins, who still would not meet her eyes. "Thank you for 2 years of work," Grace said. "I hope you can sleep tonight." She turned and walked out of the office. She walked through the store one last time, past the deli where Dante was slicing meat, past produce where Maria was stacking apples, past old Mr. Coleman with his week-old newspaper, past Keisha, who looked up from register 2 and saw Grace's face and knew. Keisha's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Grace shook her head slightly. Not now, not here. She walked out through the automatic doors and into the parking lot and stood in the cold November air and breathed. She was 26 years old. She was unemployed. She had less than $4 to her name. Her rent was due in 2 weeks. She had no savings, no family, no safety net. The folder from Edith Morrow was sitting on her kitchen table, but she had not signed anything, and she did not know if the offer was real or if it would survive when Edith learned that Grace had been fired from the very store Edith secretly owned. Everything was falling apart. She could feel it. The way you feel a building start to lean before it collapses. The slow shift, the creak, the certainty that gravity always wins. Grace sat on the bench at the bus stop and waited. The sky was the color of concrete. She pulled her coat tight with one hand because the zipper was still broken. She watched the traffic pass. Cars, trucks, a school bus full of children whose lives were still simple enough to fit inside a yellow bus. She thought about calling Keisha. She thought about calling Thomas Whitfield. She thought about calling no one and just sitting here until the cold made her numb enough to stop feeling. Instead, she pulled out her phone and did something she had not done in a long time. She called her mother's number. The number was disconnected, of course. It had been disconnected for 3 years. But Grace called it anyway. She held the phone to her ear and listened to the automated message that said the number was no longer in service. She listened to it 3 times. Then she put the phone back in her pocket and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The bus came. She got on. She went home. The apartment felt smaller than usual. The stain on the ceiling looked bigger. The dripping faucet was louder. Grace sat at the kitchen table and stared at the folder. She opened it. She read the documents again, every word, every clause, every number. Then she picked up Thomas Whitfield's business card and dialed the number. He answered on the first ring. "Ms. Okafor," he said, as if he had been expecting her call. "I need to tell you something," Grace said. "I was fired today, from Value Basket. The man from the store, the one with the $100 bill, he had me terminated." There was a pause. Then Thomas Whitfield said, in a voice as calm as still water, "I know." Grace blinked. "You know?" Another pause. "Ms. Morrow knows as well. She was informed within an hour of the corporate call. Ms. Okafor, I want you to understand something. Nothing happens at Value Basket without Ms. Morrow eventually finding out. She may be invisible to the public, but she sees everything. She saw the termination order. She knows who made the call. She knows who followed the order. And she is, at this moment, very angry." Grace felt something shift inside her. A gear turning, a door opening. "What does that mean?" she asked. Thomas Whitfield's voice took on a careful, measured quality. "It means that Mr. Hale has made a serious mistake. He has used his position as a minority shareholder to influence the termination of an employee who was acting in the best interest of a customer. More importantly, he has done it without knowing that the customer in question is the majority owner of the company. In legal terms, Ms. Okafor, Mr. Hale has just set himself on fire and does not know it yet." Grace pressed the phone against her ear so hard that the plastic dug into her skin. "Ms. Okafor," Thomas continued, "Ms. Morrow would like to see you tomorrow. Same time, same place. But I want to prepare you. The conversation will be different this time." This is no longer just about a scholarship or a trust. This has become something else. Grace swallowed. What has it become? She asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, justice. That night, Grace did not sleep. She lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and felt something happening inside her that she had never felt before. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something colder and clearer, like ice forming on a window pane. She was tired of being pushed. She was tired of being small. She was tired of having her fate decided by men with money who had never scrubbed a floor or counted pennies or eaten ramen for 3 days because they gave their food money to a stranger. Her mother had taught her to be kind. She had been kind, and she had been punished for it. That was the part that did not sit right. That was the part that scratched at her like a nail in a shoe. She got up at 3 in the morning and sat at the kitchen table in the dark. She opened the folder one more time. She read the trust documents. She read the scholarship offer. She read the clause that said, the trustee reserves the right to modify the terms of this trust at any time and for any reason. She closed the folder. She made coffee. She sat in the dark kitchen with the coffee warming her hands, and she made a decision. She was done waiting for the world to be fair. She was going to make it fair. Saturday morning, 9 o'clock. The town car, the gate, the mansion, the marble foyer, the clock ticking. Grace was wearing her black dress again, but this time she walked through the house differently. Not like a guest, like someone who had been invited back because she belonged. Thomas Whitfield led her to the same room with the fireplace. But this time, Edith was not alone. There were 3 other people in the room, 2 women and a man. One of the women was young, maybe Grace's age, with a sharp face and a tablet in her hand. The man was older, silver-haired, with the look of someone who had spent his entire career in boardrooms. The other woman was middle-aged, round-faced, with the tired eyes of a person who fights battles for a living. Grace, Edith said from her armchair, these are my people. Sit down. We have work to do. Edith introduced them. The young woman was Yemi Adeyemi, Edith's personal assistant and the only person under 40 who knew Edith's true identity. The older man was Franklin Greer, Edith's financial advisor, who had managed her wealth for 20 years. The middle-aged woman was Patricia Coleman, a corporate attorney who specialized in shareholder disputes and employment law. They all shook Grace's hand. They all looked at her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something that looked like admiration. Grace sat down. The fire was burning again. But the warmth felt different today, sharper. Edith spoke first. Richard Hale used his minority stake in my company to have you fired, she said. He did this because you embarrassed him. Because you, a cashier making $11 an hour, refused to participate in his cruelty. He cannot tolerate that. Men like him never can. She paused. The fire popped. I built Value Basket from nothing. I built it with these hands. She held up her hands, thin and veined, but still strong. I will not allow a man like Richard Hale to use my company as a weapon against a woman who did nothing wrong. Patricia. Patricia Coleman leaned forward. She had a folder of her own, thicker than Grace's. Mr. Hale's call to corporate was recorded, she said. Company policy. All shareholder communications are logged. In that recording, he explicitly states that he wants you terminated because you, and I quote his language loosely here, humiliated him in front of other customers. He does not cite any legitimate customer service violation. He cites personal grievance. This is, in clear terms, an abuse of shareholder influence, and it constitutes wrongful termination. Grace felt the cold, clear thing inside her grow sharper. She sat very still and listened. Furthermore, Patricia continued, Mr. Hale's behavior in the store, the throwing of money, the verbal harassment of an elderly customer, is itself a violation of the store's code of conduct for patrons. There is security camera footage that corroborates your account. Mr. Coleman, the security guard, has also provided a written statement. He saw everything. Grace thought of old Mr. Coleman with his week-old newspaper. He had been watching after all. Here is what we propose, Thomas Whitfield said, standing by the fireplace with his hands behind his back. 3 things. First, your termination is reversed immediately. You will receive full back pay plus a formal apology from the store manager and from the corporate office. Second, we file a wrongful termination claim against Value Basket's parent company, naming Mr. Hale as the instigating party. The company will settle because the alternative is a public trial where the majority owner testifies against a minority shareholder, and no board in the world wants that kind of publicity. He paused. Third, and this is Ms. Morrow's personal decision, Mr. Hale's 20% stake in Value Basket's parent company comes up for review at the next board meeting. Ms. Morrow intends to exercise her majority position to dilute his shares and remove his seat on the advisory board. In simple terms, Ms. Okafor, Mr. Hale is about to learn what it feels like to have the ground pulled out from under him. Grace looked at Edith. The old woman was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes steady as stone. There was no anger in her face, no cruelty, just something quiet and certain and immovable. The look of a woman who had spent 60 years building something and was not about to let anyone tear it down. "Mrs. Morrow," Grace said, "you do not have to do all this. What happened to me? It happens to people every day. People lose their jobs for standing up. That is just the way it is." Edith tilted her head. "Is it?" she said. "Is that the way it is? Or is it the way it is because people with the power to change it choose not to?" Grace had no answer for that. Or rather, she had the answer, but it was the kind of answer that changes things once you say it out loud. So she said it. "You are right," she whispered. "It does not have to be this way." Edith nodded. "Then let us change it," she said. And for the first time since Grace's mother died, she felt something she had forgotten existed. Hope. Not the wishful kind, not the kind that floats away when you breathe on it. The solid kind. The kind that has teeth. The next 2 weeks moved fast. Patricia Coleman filed the wrongful termination claim. The corporate office, upon learning that the complaint came from a law firm that represented the majority owner of their parent company, went into a state of panic that Grace imagined looked something like an anthill that had been kicked. Phone calls were made. Meetings were held. Emails flew back and forth with increasing urgency. Grace was reinstated within 48 hours. Mr. Perkins called her personally to tell her, and his voice had a quality she had never heard in it before. Something between respect and fear. Grace did not go back to work right away. Thomas Whitfield advised her to take 2 weeks of paid administrative leave while the legal process unfolded. Grace spent those 2 weeks doing something she had not done since her mother died. She rested. She slept until 7 instead of 5:15. She cooked real meals instead of ramen. Edith had insisted on providing an immediate stipend of $2,000, calling it an advance on the trust, and Grace had resisted at first, but then accepted it because the alternative was eating peanut butter toast for another month and pretending she was fine. She visited Edith 3 times during those 2 weeks. Each visit was longer than the last. They sat in the room with the fireplace and talked. Edith told Grace about building Value Basket. The early years, when she slept in the back of the first store because she could not afford rent. The time she was robbed at gunpoint and opened the store the next morning anyway. The day she opened her 10th store and stood in the parking lot and cried because her daughter had just gotten into college and everything seemed possible. And she told Grace about Amara, about her daughter's laugh, which filled rooms the same way Grace's mother's laugh had. About the way Amara used to sit on the floor of the first store and do her homework while Edith worked the register. About the phone call. The one that came on a Tuesday afternoon in 1997. The state trooper's voice. The words that ended one world and began another. "Ma'am, there has been an accident." Edith spoke about it quietly, the way you speak about things that are too large for your voice to hold. Grace listened, and she thought about her own phone call. The doctor at the hospital. The words that had ended her world. Different words. Same silence afterward. "After Amara died," Edith said one afternoon, "I stopped going to the stores. I stopped going anywhere. I sat in this house for 2 years. Thomas handled everything. Franklin kept the money moving. But I was gone. Dead inside. The company grew, but I did not care. I did not care about anything." She paused. The fire crackled. "Then one day, I decided to go back, to one store, just to see. I put on old clothes. I took my coins. I went shopping. And I discovered something. Nobody knew me. Nobody recognized me. I was invisible. An old woman with pennies. And that invisibility showed me things. It showed me who people really are when they think nobody important is watching. Grace leaned forward. 30 years, she said. You have been doing this for 30 years? Edith nodded. Every few months, different stores, different cities. Always the same test. And the results were always the same. People were polite when it was easy, but the moment someone with power challenged them, they folded. Every time. She looked at Grace. Until you. The fire was the only sound in the room for a long moment. Then Grace said, My mother used to say, your character is what you do when nobody important is watching. Edith closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were shining. Your mother, she said, was a wise woman. She raised something beautiful in this world. While Grace and Edith were building their connection in the quiet warmth of the mansion on Boston Boulevard, Richard Hale was living in a very different reality. He had not thought about the grocery store incident since Tuesday. For him, it was a minor irritation, like a fly that lands on your food and is waved away. He had made the call to corporate, gotten the cashier fired, and moved on. That was how Richard Hale operated. Obstacles were removed, people were replaced, problems were solved with money or power, and if neither worked, with lawyers. He sat in his corner office on the 43rd floor of the Hale Capitol building downtown, looking out at the Detroit skyline, and he thought about his upcoming golf trip to Scottsdale, and the new Porsche he had ordered, and the board meeting next month where he planned to push for a 15% increase in Value Basket's distribution fees. He did not know that a storm was coming. He did not know that the old woman he had humiliated was the owner of the grocery chain he partially owned. He did not know that his 20% stake was about to become worthless. He did not know that 3 lawyers and a financial advisor and a personal assistant and a 26-year-old former cashier were building a case against him that was as airtight as a submarine. He did not know any of this because Richard Hale had spent his entire life believing that money was a shield and that behind that shield, he was untouchable. His first hint that something was wrong came 3 weeks after the grocery store incident. He received a letter from the Value Basket parent company's legal department. It was addressed to him personally, marked confidential. He opened it with the casual disinterest of a man who receives legal mail the way other people receive junk mail. But as he read, his expression changed. The letter informed him that a wrongful termination claim had been filed in connection with his call to the corporate office. It stated that the call had been recorded and that the contents of the recording constituted evidence of shareholder overreach and personal harassment. It requested his presence at a meeting with the company's legal counsel to discuss the matter. Richard Hale read the letter twice. Then he picked up his phone and called his personal attorney, a man named Derek Voss, who charged $900 an hour and was worth every penny. Derek, Richard said, I have a problem. Derek Voss asked what kind of problem. Richard told him. Derek Voss was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, which in lawyer time was the equivalent of a long, worried silence. Richard, he said, why are you getting into public confrontations at grocery stores? And why are you calling corporate offices to get cashiers fired? You are the CEO of a private equity firm. This is beneath you. Richard's jaw tightened. Just fix it, he said. That is what I pay you for. But this was not the kind of thing that could be fixed with a phone call and a check. Because Patricia Coleman was not a small-town attorney with a shingle on a strip mall. She was a senior partner at Coleman, Richardson & Associates, one of the most respected corporate law firms in the Midwest. She had won 7 shareholder disputes in a row. She had a reputation for methodical, relentless prosecution, the kind that dismantles cases the way a surgeon dismantles a tumor, piece by piece, leaving nothing behind. And she was working pro bono, because Edith Morrow had been her client for 15 years and had never once asked for anything until now. The meeting was held at the Value Basket corporate office, a glass and steel building in Southfield. Richard Hale arrived with Derek Voss. Patricia Coleman arrived with Thomas Whitfield. Grace was not there. Edith was not there, but their presence filled the room like smoke. Patricia opened a laptop and played the recorded phone call. Richard's voice filled the conference room, loud and arrogant and unmistakable. "I want the cashier at the Woodward store fired. Today. She embarrassed me in front of other customers. I am a 20% shareholder, and I will not tolerate being disrespected by minimum wage staff." Derek Voss closed his eyes when he heard the recording. He had been a lawyer long enough to recognize a case that was already lost. Richard Hale, however, had not been humbled enough to recognize anything. He sat in his chair with his arms crossed and his chin lifted and said, "I was within my rights as a shareholder to express dissatisfaction with customer service." Patricia Coleman folded her hands on the table. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice patient and precise, "shareholders have the right to express concerns through proper channels. They do not have the right to target individual employees for personal grievances. Your own words on the recording make it clear that this was not a customer service complaint. It was retaliation. The employee, Ms. Okafor, was acting within her duties and, in fact, was protecting a customer from verbal harassment. Your harassment, Mr. Hale." Richard leaned forward. "That old woman was holding up the line. She was paying with change. I offered to help. That cashier was rude to me." Patricia opened a folder. Inside was a series of photographs, stills from the store's security camera. She placed them on the table, one at a time. The first showed Richard standing behind the old woman, his face twisted with impatience. The second showed him throwing the $100 bill. The trajectory was clear. The bill was aimed at the woman's face, not her hand, not the counter. The third showed Grace picking up the bill, her face calm, her posture straight. The fourth showed the old woman walking away with her groceries. "These images," Patricia said, "along with the written statement from the store's security guard and the testimony of 3 other employees who witnessed the incident, paint a clear picture. You did not offer to help, Mr. Hale. You assaulted an elderly woman's dignity in a public place and then used your corporate position to punish the person who stood up for her." Derek Voss put his hand on Richard's arm, the universal lawyer gesture for "stop talking." Richard shook it off. "This is absurd," he said, his voice rising. "Do you know how much money I have invested in this company? I own 20%. I have a right to be heard." Patricia nodded. "You do, and you will be heard. At the board meeting next month, where the majority shareholder will be presenting a motion to dilute your stake and remove your advisory position." Richard's face changed. The redness drained out of it, leaving something pale and uncertain. "The majority shareholder," he repeated. "Who is the majority shareholder?" Patricia smiled. It was a small smile, but it was devastating in its quietness. "My client prefers to remain anonymous at this time," she said, "but you will meet them at the board meeting. I suggest you prepare yourself." Richard Hale left that meeting and drove straight to his office. He called his financial analyst. He called his broker. He called 3 different sources who had connections to Value Basket's parent company. He spent 6 hours trying to find out who owned the 51% majority stake. He found nothing. The shares were held through a series of trusts and holding companies, all managed by Thomas Whitfield's law firm, all perfectly legal, all completely opaque. It was like trying to find a person hiding behind a wall of mirrors. Every reflection led to another reflection. There was no face behind any of them. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Richard Hale felt something he did not recognize. It took him a moment to identify it. It was fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from physical danger, the other kind. The kind that comes when you realize that you have been playing a game you do not understand, against an opponent you cannot see, and you are losing. The board meeting was scheduled for the second Thursday in December. The weeks leading up to it were filled with preparation, tension, and a growing sense of inevitability. Grace spent those weeks with Edith almost every day. They talked, they ate meals together, they sat in the warm room by the fireplace and told each other stories. Grace told Edith about her childhood, about the apartment she grew up in, about the school she attended, about the day her mother was diagnosed, about the 6 months that followed, about the funeral where only 7 people came, about the silence that moved in afterward and never left. Edith listened to every word. She never interrupted. She never offered solutions or platitudes or the hollow comfort that people give when they do not know what to say. She just listened. And in the listening, Grace felt something loosen inside her, something she had been carrying alone for 3 years. It did not disappear. Grief does not disappear, but it shifted. It made room. And into that room, something new began to grow. Edith also told Grace more about Amara. She showed Grace photographs. Amara as a baby, fat-cheeked and bright-eyed. Amara at 5, standing in front of the First Value basket store with a gap-toothed grin. Amara at 16, tall and serious, reading a book on the porch. Amara at 22, in her college graduation gown, holding her diploma like a trophy. Grace looked at each photograph and saw the resemblance that Edith had seen, not in the face, in the eyes, in the way Amara looked at the camera with that same fierce gentleness, the same look Grace's mother had, the same look Grace carried without knowing it. One evening, a week before the board meeting, Edith handed Grace a small box. It was old, wooden, with a tarnished brass clasp. "Amara's," Edith said. Grace opened it. Inside was a necklace, a thin gold chain with a small pendant shaped like an Adinkra symbol. "That is the Sankofa," Edith said. "It means go back and get it. It means that whatever you have lost, you can reach back and reclaim it." Amara wore it every day. Grace held the necklace in her palm. It was warm from being inside the box, as if it had been waiting for someone's skin. "I want you to have it," Edith said. "Not because you are Amara. You are not. You are Grace. But because you carry the same thing she carried, the same light. And that light needs to be worn where people can see it." Grace put the necklace on. The pendant rested against her collarbone, light and warm. She touched it with her fingers and felt something click into place inside her, the way a key clicks when it finds its lock. She did not cry. She was beyond tears now. She was in a different place entirely, a place where grief and gratitude lived side by side and did not fight each other, a place where she could hold her mother's memory in one hand and reach toward her future with the other. The night before the board meeting, Grace could not sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with the lights off and a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. She thought about everything that had happened in the past month. The coins on the counter, the $100 bill, the look on Richard Hale's face, the letter, the mansion, Edith's eyes, Amara's necklace, which she was wearing now, the Sankofa pendant catching the faint light from the street lamp outside her window. She thought about her mother. She thought about what Aduni would say if she could see her daughter right now, sitting in a dark kitchen on the eve of something enormous. She knew what her mother would say. She could hear it as clearly as if Aduni were sitting across the table. "Grace, you do not need to be angry. You do not need to be afraid. You just need to be exactly who you are. The rest will take care of itself." Grace finished her coffee. It was cold, but she drank it anyway. She washed the cup, dried it, and placed it back on the shelf. She went to bed. She slept. And for the first time in 3 years, she did not dream of her mother's hospital room. She dreamed of a field, green and wide and quiet, and she was walking through it, not toward anything, not away from anything, just walking, free. The board meeting was held in the conference room on the 28th floor of the Value Basket parent company's headquarters in Southfield. The room was large, glass-walled, with a long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs. It smelled like expensive carpet and fresh coffee. The board members arrived in ones and twos. There were 12 of them. Men and women in tailored suits with serious faces and heavy watches. They represented institutional investors, private equity partners, and independent directors. They exchanged handshakes and small talk and took their seats around the table. Richard Hale arrived last. He wore his best charcoal suit. His hair was freshly cut. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He carried a leather portfolio and a confidence that was, by now, almost entirely performative. He had spent the past 3 weeks trying to find out who the majority shareholder was. He had failed. His lawyer, Derek Voss, had advised him to cooperate, settle the wrongful termination claim, and keep his head down. Richard had done none of these things. Cooperation was not in his vocabulary. He sat down at the table and placed his portfolio in front of him like a weapon. The meeting began with the usual business: quarterly reports, Distribution numbers, expansion plans. Richard barely listened. He was watching the door. Patricia Coleman had told him that the majority shareholder would attend this meeting. He had been waiting for this moment. He needed to see who he was dealing with. He needed to put a face on the enemy. At 10:15, the door opened. Thomas Whitfield entered first. Behind him was Patricia Coleman. Behind her was Yemi Adeyemi with her tablet. And behind all of them, walking slowly but steadily, was Edith Morrow. She wore a simple dark blue dress, no jewelry except the thin gold bracelet. Her hair was pulled back under a navy scarf. She looked like what she was, an 82-year-old woman who had built an empire with her bare hands. She entered the room and something changed in the air. Not a sound, not a movement, something more fundamental. The board members turned to look at her. Most of them had never seen her before. A few had heard rumors. None of them were prepared. Thomas Whitfield spoke first. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," he said, his voice filling the room like a church organ. "Allow me to introduce my client and yours. Mrs. Edith Adebayo Morrow, founder of Value Basket, majority shareholder of Morrow Holdings, the parent company of this corporation, owner of 51% of all outstanding shares." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Grace had ever heard, and she was not even in the room yet. She was standing in the hallway outside, waiting. Thomas had told her to wait for the right moment. The moment was not yet. Richard Hale's face underwent a transformation that would have been fascinating to watch in slow motion. First, confusion. His brow furrowed. He looked at the old woman and tried to place her. Then recognition. His eyes widened. The grocery store, the coins, the brown coat, the faded scarf, the trembling hands. This was the woman he had humiliated, the woman he had told to buy her dignity, and she was the owner. She was the owner of the entire company. The color drained from Richard's face so completely that he looked like a man watching his own ghost leave his body. Edith Morrow took a seat at the head of the table. She did not rush. She did not speak immediately. She let the silence do its work. She looked around the room at each board member in turn, acknowledging them with a slight nod. When her gaze reached Richard Hale, she held it. Those dark, sharp eyes, the same eyes that had watched Grace count pennies, the same eyes that had studied Grace's face in the firelight, locked onto Richard Hale with the force of a closing vault door. She held his gaze for 5 seconds, then 10. Richard did not look away. He could not. He was frozen. "I built this company," Edith said. Her voice was quiet, but in the silent room, it carried like thunder. "I built it from one store on the east side of Detroit. I carried rice bags and mopped floors and counted pennies in the register. I built it because I believe that everyone, no matter how much or how little money they have, deserves to be treated with respect when they buy their food. That belief is the foundation of everything you see on those reports." She pointed to the papers on the table. Every number, every store, every dollar, it all started with respect. She paused. The board members sat perfectly still. Not one of them moved. Patricia Coleman opened a laptop and connected it to the room's projector. On the screen appeared the security camera footage from the Value Basket on Woodward Avenue. Patricia pressed play. The room watched as Richard Hale threw the $100 bill at Edith's face. They watched as Grace picked it up and handed it back. They watched as Grace paid for the groceries herself. They watched as the old woman walked out in silence. Richard Hale gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles went white. His jaw clenched so tight that a muscle jumped beneath his ear. He wanted to speak. He wanted to explain. He wanted to reframe the narrative, to spin it the way he spun everything, with money and leverage and the sheer force of his refusal to be wrong. But there was nothing to spin. The camera had seen everything. Every gesture, every expression, every second of contempt that could not be edited or denied. "Mr. Hale," Edith said, turning to face him directly, "you told me to buy my dignity. Do you remember?" Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He closed it. "I want you to know," Edith continued, "that I was not offended. I was not hurt. I have been treated worse than that more times than you have had hot meals. What offended me was what you did after. You used the company I built to punish a young woman who stood up for me. You used my company as your personal weapon. That, Mr. Hale, is something I will not tolerate." The door to the conference room opened. Thomas Whitfield stood in the doorway and stepped aside. Grace Okafor walked in. She was wearing the black dress. Her hair was down. The Sankofa pendant glinted at her collarbone. She walked to the empty chair next to Edith and sat down. She did not look at Richard Hale. She looked straight ahead, her posture perfect, her hands folded on the table. She was calm. She was steady. She was a different person than the woman who had stood behind register 4 counting pennies 5 weeks ago. Not because anything external had changed, because something internal had shifted. She had stopped being a person things happened to. She had become a person who decided what happened next. Richard Hale looked at Grace, and for the first time, he saw her. Not as a cashier, not as a minimum wage obstacle, as a person. A person who had beaten him, not with money, not with lawyers, not with power. With something he had never understood and never would: character. He looked at her, and something moved behind his eyes, not remorse. Men like Richard Hale do not feel remorse easily, but recognition. The recognition that he had been weighed and measured and found wanting by a woman who counted pennies for old ladies and paid for strangers' groceries with her last $15. Patricia Coleman distributed copies of a document to each board member. The document outlined 3 motions for a vote. First, the formal reinstatement of Grace Okafor with full back pay, benefits, and a formal apology from the corporate office. Second, the dilution of Richard Hale's shares from 20% to 5%, in accordance with the shareholder agreement's clause on conduct detrimental to the company's interests. Third, the removal of Richard Hale from the advisory board, effective immediately. Richard's attorney, Derek Voss, stood up. "This is outrageous," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. He had seen the footage. He had heard the recording. He knew. "My client's investment in this company is substantial, and these motions represent a punitive overreach that will be challenged in court." Patricia Coleman looked at him with the calm expression of a woman who has been threatened by better lawyers than Derek Voss. "Mr. Voss," she said, "your client's shareholder agreement includes a morality clause. Section 14, paragraph 3. Any shareholder whose conduct brings disrepute upon the company, harms its employees, or violates its stated values of dignity and respect may be subject to share dilution and board removal by majority vote. Your client signed this agreement 7 years ago. It is enforceable. And the footage you just watched is all the evidence we need." Derek Voss sat down. He whispered something to Richard. Richard shook his head. He was not going down without a fight. He stood up. His chair scraped backward on the carpet. He put both hands on the table and leaned forward. "You want to destroy me over a grocery store?" he said, his voice tight and trembling with the kind of rage that comes from a man who is not used to losing. "Over a handful of coins and a cashier? I have $800 million. I have built companies. I have created jobs. I have been on the cover of Forbes. And you want to take my seat because I told an old woman to hurry up?" The room was silent. 12 board members, 3 lawyers, a financial advisor, a personal assistant, a cashier, and an 82-year-old woman who had built a grocery empire from a single store in Detroit. All of them looking at Richard Hale. All of them watching him crumble. Grace spoke. She had not planned to. She had planned to sit quietly and let the lawyers handle everything. But something rose in her, and she let it come. "Mr. Hale," she said, and her voice was clear and even and absolutely steady. "You did not just tell an old woman to hurry up. You threw money at her face. You told her to buy her dignity. And then you had me fired for not letting you get away with it. That is not a grocery store problem. That is a character problem. And no amount of money fixes that." The room went still. Not silent, still. The kind of stillness that happens when everyone in a room recognizes that something true has been said, something that cannot be argued with or bought off or spun. Richard Hale stared at Grace. His mouth opened and closed. He had no words. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Richard Hale had nothing to say. The vote was taken. 12 board members, All three motions passed unanimously. Grace's reinstatement, Richard's share dilution, Richard's removal from the board, 12-0, not one dissenting voice. Richard Hale gathered his portfolio, put on his coat, and walked out of the conference room without looking at anyone. Derek Voss followed him. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded, to Grace, like the period at the end of a sentence. After the meeting, Grace and Edith sat in the back of the town car. The car was parked in the underground garage of the building. The engine was off. It was quiet. Edith reached over and took Grace's hand. They sat like that for a long time, two women who had come from different decades but the same country, who had been cleaned women and cashiers and invisible people, who had lost daughters and mothers, who had been told their whole lives that they were less, and who had proven, in the quietest possible way, that they were more. "Your mother would be proud," Edith said. Grace closed her eyes. "She would have liked you," Grace whispered. "She would have loved your coins." Edith laughed, that warm, surprised laugh that sounded like it had been stored away for years and was only now being let out. "My coins," she said. "Those coins have been my best test, better than any interview, better than any resume. You learn more about a person in 5 minutes of counting pennies than in 5 years of board meetings." The weeks that followed were full of change. Grace signed the trust documents. She enrolled at Wayne State University for the spring semester. She chose social work as her major because she wanted to help people the way her mother had helped her. Not with money, but with presence, with showing up, with not looking away. She kept working at Value Basket, but now she worked part-time, 20 hours a week, because she wanted to, not because she had to. She wanted to stay connected to the place where everything had changed. Keisha cried when Grace told her the full story. Big, loud, mascara-ruining tears that she wiped with the back of her hand while saying, "I knew it. I knew something was up with that old lady. She had the eyes, Grace. She had the eyes." Dante from the deli counter shook his head and said, "This is better than anything on Netflix." Old Mr. Coleman, the security guard, smiled quietly and went back to his newspaper. Mr. Perkins said nothing. He had become noticeably more polite since the board meeting. Richard Hale's world contracted rapidly. The share dilution cost him hundreds of millions in projected value. His removal from the advisory board was reported in the Detroit Free Press, which ran a story about the incident without naming Edith but describing an anonymous majority shareholder. Richard's reputation, which had been built on the perception of invincibility, cracked. Business partners reconsidered. Invitations dried up. The country club where he played golf every Saturday became a place where people whispered behind his back instead of greeting him with handshakes and smiles. He was not ruined. Men with $800 million are not easily ruined. But he was diminished. And for a man like Richard Hale, diminishment was worse than destruction. Grace visited Edith every Sunday. It became their ritual. They would sit in the room with the fireplace and drink tea and talk, sometimes about the past, sometimes about the future, sometimes about nothing at all. Grace brought Edith Nigerian food that she cooked herself, recipes she had learned from her mother: jollof rice, puff puff, plantain. Edith ate every bite and asked for seconds. Grace wore the Sankofa pendant every day. She touched it sometimes without thinking, the way you touch something that has become a part of your body. One Sunday, about 3 months after the board meeting, Edith said something that Grace would carry for the rest of her life. They were sitting by the fire. The winter sun was low and golden through the window. Edith was holding her teacup with both hands, looking into it as if she could read the future in the leaves. "Grace," she said, "I have lived a long time. I have built a big thing, but the biggest thing I have learned is this. The world is not changed by the people with the most money. It is changed by the people with the most courage. Courage to be kind when cruelty is easier. Courage to stand when everyone else sits. Courage to give when you have nothing." She looked up. "You had nothing that day, child. $14, and you gave 15. Grace smiled. "I was short $1, she said. "My register was off." Edith laughed. "Your register was off," she repeated, shaking her head. "The whole world was off. You said it right." They sat in comfortable silence. The fire popped. The clock ticked. The lavender scent drifted through the room. 2 women, 2 stories, 1 beginning. 6 months later, Grace stood in the value basket on Woodward Avenue one last time. Not as a cashier, as a customer. She was buying groceries: rice, bread, peanut butter, eggs, bananas. The same groceries Edith had bought that morning in November. She placed them on the belt at Register 4. The new cashier, a young woman named Destiny, scanned them with practiced efficiency. Grace paid, not with coins, not with a credit card, with a $20 bill. She told Destiny to keep the change. "For the next person who comes up short," Grace said. Destiny looked confused but pleased. Grace took her bag and walked toward the door. She paused at the exit. She looked back at the store. The fluorescent lights, the scuffed linoleum, the deli counter where Dante was still slicing meat, the produce section where Maria was still stacking apples, Register 2 where Keisha was applying lip gloss and telling a customer a story that was making them laugh. Old Mr. Coleman was sitting on his stool, reading a newspaper that was probably still a week old. It was the same store, the same people, the same life happening in small, ordinary, beautiful ways. But Grace was different now. She touched the Sankofa pendant at her collarbone. Go back and get it. She had gone back. She had gotten it. Not the money, not the scholarship, not the trust. Something bigger. Something her mother had planted in her years ago, and Edith Morrow had watered with recognition. She walked out into the spring sunshine. The air smelled like warm pavement and blooming trees and possibility. Her phone buzzed. A text from Edith. 2 words. Come Sunday. Grace smiled and typed back. Always. She put the phone in her pocket and walked to her car. She had a car now, not a new one, a used Honda Civic with 140,000 miles on it. But the heater worked, and the doors locked, and the radio played, and that was enough. That was more than enough. She drove home. Not to the old apartment with the stained ceiling and the damp carpet and the broken radiator. To a new apartment. A small 1-bedroom near the university, clean and quiet, with windows that let in real sunlight, and a kitchen where she could cook her mother's recipes without the stove catching fire. She parked the car and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, looking at the building where she lived now. It was not a mansion. It was not a dream. It was a beginning. On the kitchen counter was a framed photograph. Grace had placed it there on her first day in the apartment, before she unpacked anything else. It was a picture of her mother, Aduni Okafor, standing in front of the hotel where she had worked for 16 years. She was smiling. That wide, room-filling smile. She was wearing her uniform, a white blouse and black pants, and she looked tired and happy and proud all at once. Next to the photograph was the cloth pouch of coins that Edith had given Grace as a gift. For luck, Edith had said, and for remember. Grace set her groceries on the counter next to the photograph. She put the rice in the cupboard. She put the eggs in the fridge. She placed the bananas on the counter where they would ripen in the sun. Then she stood there, in her quiet kitchen, in her small apartment, wearing the Sankofa pendant and looking at her mother's photograph. The evening light came through the window and turned everything gold. The coins in the pouch glinted. Her mother's smile glowed. And Grace thought about the morning in the grocery store, the pennies on the counter, the $100 bill floating down, the sound of her own voice, steady and clear, saying, "She does not need your money, and she does not need your opinion." She opened her cupboard and looked at the full shelves. Rice, beans, pasta, canned soup, peanut butter, bread, all the small things that hold a life together. She closed the cupboard and leaned against the counter and breathed. The apartment was quiet. Not the old kind of quiet, the kind that was empty and echoing and full of absence. This quiet was different. It was full. Full of what she had built, full of what she had been given, full of what she had earned, not with money, but with the only currency that mattered. Grace Okafor made herself a cup of coffee. She sat at her kitchen table. She drank it slowly, tasting every sip. For the first time in as long as she could remember, it did not taste bitter. Thank you for staying until the end. If you enjoyed the story, please support the channel with a like. Take care.